Now that the NBA season is over and big-time trades and front office moves are taking place, we can finally say that we're in the thick of the off-season. And along with the ongoing coverage of the various free agency trades and signings, we've entered the golden time of year for NBA player podcasts. And we've gotten a ton of legendary clips, ranging from Kenyon Martin swearing up and down that Tracy McGrady never cooked him, to Paul George implying that a trio of him, Andre Drummond, and Reggie Jackson would have been able to make a deep postseason run. There's been no shortage of interesting player conversation to go around. However, during an appearance on Theo Pinson's Run Your Race podcast, when discussing the legendary 2014 FIBA team that featured Kyrie Irving, Steph Curry, and James Harden, Demar Derozan made the claim that the best player on that team statistically was Kenneth Faried. And just the mention of his name brought back waves of memories about his gravity-defying, eye-popping highlights that have been more or less forgotten as Faried's archetype of player have been phased out of the league. But in looking at his career and his extremely high, albeit brief, peak, along with how he slowly disappeared from the league, we can learn a lot about what makes a player archetype obsolete, the rapidly shifting landscape of the league, and what legacy can mean to a guy who's been so quickly forgotten by the broader NBA fanbase. So, let's talk about Kenneth Faried, the deterioration of his career, and learn what happens to a manimal forgotten. Before we can get to his time in the league and how it all came apart, we're going to briefly revisit the time just before Faried entered the league as a prospect, because his scouting report and draft profile eerily predicted exactly what would make him stand out in the league and what would have him struggling to keep a roster spot. After spending all 4 years as a dominant force at Morehead State, ending his senior year leading the Ohio Valley Conference in points and rebounds, Faried entered the 2011 NBA draft with scouts having a very clear understanding of his strengths, but also his extremely limited positional versatility, even for his era. While scouts noted his explosive athleticism and tenacity, both on the boards and in general as an energy guy, there were very obvious limits to his potential, with him only measuring 6'7.5" without shoes, while also having a skill set that likely limited him to playing the power forward in the NBA. And a scouting report from Hoops Habit in April of 2011 perfectly described the strange position Faried was in, saying, quote, "Faried is a unique talent and certainly NBA quality, but what needs to be determined is where exactly he fits in. He can be a great role player, but if a team thinks they can make him much more than that, they may be disappointed." And as we'll come to see in his career, this question of where exactly he fit in is one that he never managed to escape. And while he'd be able to outplay it briefly, eventually it'd catch up to him. But at the time of the draft, Faried was an extremely interesting prospect. And after watching him play twice at Pepsi Arena during his senior season, the Denver Nuggets used their 22nd pick to add him to their roster. Entering his rookie season, Faried was joining a team that had a very clear need for his rebounding and energy talents, as they were coming off a disappointing postseason exit, losing handedly to the Thunder in a series where they were thoroughly out-rebounded and out-efforted, with the Thunder having a massive 11.8% higher rebounding percentage than Denver. So the rebounding and energy effort that Faried brought was a welcome addition, especially as Denver found themselves in the midst of a massive retooling, as the departures of Kenyon Martin, Raymond Felton, and J.R. Smith stripped even more depth from a team that was still reeling from their midseason trade of Carmelo Anthony. Unfortunately, Faried had a fairly underwhelming start to his rookie season, only seeing action in 5 of his first 24 games, but after injuries decimated the team and forced 4 key contributors out of the lineup, Faried finally broke through and had a massive stretch. He averaged 9.8 points, 7.7 rebounds, and 1.1 blocks over his first 18 games with a consistent role, and jumped to the top of the league in nearly every defensive and rebounding box score metric, with him not only having a 14.3% defensive rebounding percentage that placed him in the 77th percentile of big men over this span, but a monster 14.3% offensive rebounding percentage that placed him in the 94th percentile amongst all bigs. And this was all on top of him maintaining a 2.5% block percentage and a 1.6% steal percentage that placed him in the 67th and 75th percentile respectively. This monster stretch as a starter emboldened Denver to bet on Faried, as on March 15th, with Kenneth having established himself as a dominant interior force for the foreseeable future, they shipped off franchise cornerstone Nene to the Wizards, committing to their undersized four-man as a starter for the remainder of the season. And as his rookie season continued on, Faried found himself as a starter and the anchor for a surprisingly good Nuggets team that managed to secure the 6th seed and face off with the Lakers in the first round, where he'd average a double-double and end an extremely impressive rookie season on a high note. So heading into the 2012-13 season, Faried's hype was at an all-time high, with him slated to be a full-time starter at the 4, and Bleacher Report claiming that he, quote, had future all-star written all over him. A sentiment that was of course meant to be a compliment, but harkened back to the claim made by Hoops Hype about what he'd be in the league. And while this would be yet another strong season, the first cracks would begin to show in his viability for the future. He'd pick right up where he left off last year, averaging 11.5 points and 9.2 rebounds, along with a steal and a block per game, once again helping the new-look Nuggets to a surprisingly dominant season where they secured the 3rd seed in the West behind a 57-win record. Faried's hustle and rebounding dominance would continue to keep him near the top of the league in block, steal, and rebounding percentage, even with his increased role. And despite the singular block that he averaged over the year, Faried's presence alone at the rim impacted the game, with opponent shot attempts at the rim dropping 0.9 percentage points when he was on the floor, placing him in the 64th percentile amongst all bigs, and showing how valuable just his presence alone was on the floor. However, Denver's strong season led them straight into a first-round matchup with the 6th-seeded Warriors and their rising star Stephen Curry. And to say that this matchup was a nightmare for Faried would be an understatement. On top of the league already experiencing an exponential leap in three-point attempts this season, with the jump between 2012 and 2013 being the largest increase the league had seen since 1994, the Warriors ranked 29th in the league in rim shot attempt frequency and 13th in the league in three-point shot attempt frequency, playing a style of basketball that utterly exposed and neutralized Faried. And as Steph Curry knocked down an NBA record 18 threes in the first 4 games of the series, the Warriors' small ball lineups with Draymond or another floor-spacing forward slotting in at the 4 spot positioned Faried as the first victim of the NBA's small ball renaissance. And with Golden State eliminating Denver in 6 games, though it wouldn't immediately spell the end of his career, this series would start the countdown. Just before the 2013-14 season though, Faried would ink a big-time extension, and while he'd be equally as effective for the total campaign, averaging 13.7 points and 8.6 rebounds on 54.5% from the field, his play following the All-Star break may have been the best basketball of his career, because over the final 31 games, as Denver struggled to a 12-19 record due to the missing key contributors in Ty Lawson and eventually Danilo Gallinari, Faried would boost his numbers to 18.8 points and 10.1 rebounds on 54.6% from the field. Over this span, as Denver found themselves 3rd in the league in pace for the season at a 100.7, Faried would see his usage rate skyrocket to 22.8%, placing him in the 88th percentile of all bigs, and his 117.3 points per 100 shot attempts place him in the 78th percentile. As part of Denver's increased pace, Faried would be able to experiment with bringing the ball up the floor off of his rebounds to help jumpstart the Nuggets' offense, a welcome sign of development and versatility that meshed with new head coach Brian Shaw's approach. And although his 65.7% field goal percentage at the rim only placed him in the 58th percentile, Faried's development finally seemed to be moving past the label of being a pure effort player. Unfortunately though, the 2014-15 season would see Shaw's plan for Faried to develop as a half-court scorer put a spotlight on his offensive shortcomings. For the first time in his career, Faried's raw numbers would drop, falling to 12.6 points and 8.9 rebounds on 50.7% from the field, a noticeable drop that was brought about by the integration of half-court post-up opportunities by Shaw. According to an article from longtime Nuggets writer Adam Mayers, Faried would receive 2.3 post-up possessions per game, and he'd be terrible, only scoring 0.69 points per possession despite being the most frequent post-up player on the team. And these numbers become even worse when you realize that as a pick and roll man, he scored 1.03 points per possession. In transition, he scored 1.12 points per possession, and on putbacks, he scored 1.19 points per possession. All areas where he was given less opportunities than his lackluster post-ups. Faried's on-ball struggles are exactly what his scouting report had predicted would be his downfall. And when you partner this with his spot-up shooting attempts steadily increasing this year to follow the trends of the league, the writing on the wall for the end of Faried's career begins to become clear as day. And though we'd have some marginal improvement in the 2015-16 season, what little strides he made with his offensive issues would be compounded with his defensive struggles adapting to a changing league. Through the 2015-16 season, though we'd bounced back slightly from the previous year, averaging 12.5 points and 8.7 rebounds on 55.8% from the field, his growth as a post-up player would be what turned heads, as his post-up possessions would drop to 1.4 a game, but he'd score 0.94 points per 100 possessions, a massive improvement from a year ago, which placed him in the 77th percentile of the league. Unfortunately, this growth was offset by his defensive struggles, and according to an article from Christopher Dempsey of the Denver Post, Faried's three most commonly guarded actions were post-ups, spot-ups, and pick and rolls, where opponents scored a whopping 47.9% of the time against Faried, who routinely sank under screens and retreated to the basket almost instinctively. And as we all know, not being able to guard pick and rolls, spot-ups, or provide any semblance of offensive versatility or spacing is a kiss of death in the modern league. And in the following season, Faried would have to add injuries to a rapidly expanding list of struggles. Through the year, as Faried was only able to play in 61 games due to a back injury, his numbers would take a hit, dropping to 9.6 points and 7.6 rebounds on 54.8% from the field. While his offensive rebounding would continue to stay at the top of the league and even help elevate the rebounding of a second-year Nikola Jokic, his offense would more or less return to being created for him by others, with him having a 26.9 and 25.2% frequency on cuts and putbacks, scoring 1.18 and 1.09 points respectively in these actions. Though there'd still be a post-up wrinkle in his game and he'd have an 11.8% post-up frequency, ultimately, this play was reserved for the likes of Nikola Jokic and Jusuf Nurkic, the two emerging big men who would quickly become favorites of head coach Mike Malone. And by the time the 2017-18 season rolled around, Faried's role had been more or less erased. This year, Denver would acquire Paul Millsap and Trey Lyles prior to the season, two power forwards that slotted in better next to Jokic and provided the shooting and spacing that was a staple in the league by this point. And as a result, Faried was mostly relegated to the bench, only appearing in 32 games when Lyles or Millsap suffered an injury. And by season's end, the writing was on the wall for Faried, and on July 18th, Denver dealt him to the Brooklyn Nets in a salary dump that would essentially mark the end of his career, as he'd only appear in 12 games for Brooklyn before being traded to Houston, where he'd attempt to add a three-point wrinkle to mesh with the Rockets' core, but limited opportunities and a reputation that preceded him ended a dominant career with a whimper. The story of Kenneth Faried is one that we've seen play out countless times in the league, but in his example, it's made all the more tragic by the way that his career was ended by a mixture of unrealistic expectations in a league that shifted before his very eyes. As a prospect, the warning was issued clear as day that Faried was who he was, and that the idea of him becoming an all-star or superstar would set everyone up for disappointment. And yet, the constant stretches of big-time play and flashes of half-court offensive production created a trap that coaches and fans alike constantly fell into. And rather than accepting the big man for the rebounding effort guy he was, there was a constant effort to mold him into some sort of offensive weapon or superstar. And as the league shifted before our eyes, he was made obsolete before he even knew it. But at the same time, for those who watch the games and remember the prime years of the Manimal, it's understood that his impact went beyond simple box score watching or floor spacing capability. And the spirit of what he brought to a team can be imitated, but never duplicated. So to circle back to the beginning of the video, props to Demar Derozan for shedding light on a guy who rarely gets his props and doesn't have a ton of accolades to show for his dominance. Because the real will always remember the manimal. But with all that being said, that's gonna do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I can catch you in the next one.